What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I think at this point, it's pretty fair to say that the metagame has solidified. The same few decks with some mild alterations have been passing the metagame around like the collection plate at church. Everything is taking turns being the number one thing on the tier list, but fundamentally what's going on is that there are just like 4 decks that are pretty clearly a cut above everything else, but not so far above everything else that other things can't succeed. Just that if you're defining a metagame, you have to define it by pretty much these 4 decks. And the first of the decks is, of course, the non-Silver Surfer Captain Carter combo list. This list did get the addition of Spider-Man Brand New Day, who is excellent, and you would play even if he wasn't a buff synergy card, just for the ability to move multiple cards. There is, of course, one flex slot. I am currently using Mercury in that flex slot out of deference to the multiple man list, which is, spoiler alert, one of the decks that's been passing the metagame around recently. This is definitely an extremely powerful list, and it is the list that sets the tone the absolute most in terms of power output. If you're looking to define the metagame, this is the North Star. It is the one that represents the highest possible amount of power in the normal confines of Marvel Snap, but also is notably disruptible. This is an extremely powerful list that sets the tone for everything else, the level 1 deck of this metagame. Next up is Victoria Hand. Victoria Hand is a very strong list that relies pretty heavily on Gambit, Horseman of Death, and a variety of tech cards. Now, there are 2 Victoria Hand lists here, but we all know what they're gonna be. There's the super teched out and how dare you have any fun version of Victoria Hand, which, for the record, you can get a Mercury in instead of the Scarlet Witch or instead of the Shadow King. If you so choose to do that, it is a very viable thing for you to try to do. I typically lean on Gambit in those matchups. The combination of Gambit and Shadow King, I feel like, is enough to handle most of the things that Mercury would handle, but if you do not feel that way, or if you're tired of the many men deck getting a multiple man that cannot be gambited by using their symbiote Spider-Man, you can definitely also go for the Mercury. The flexibility and power of this list is largely down to how efficient Gambit and Victoria Hand are at scaling with each other and with generally created cards. But it's not to be missed that the cards Mirage and Iron Patriot are just really good cards that are genuinely a lot better than a lot of the other support synergy pieces that you see in other decks. Similarly, this list is a V-Hand list aimed at going extra tall. You can also run a Mercury in here instead of the Mobius, or a Shadow King instead of the Mobius, but you are a much more proactive list as opposed to a reactive one. I actually find that this list is a little bit stronger, personally, and has a little bit more clear lines in terms of how you're going to approach each matchup and when you should be snapping and retreating. That could be personal preference, but I do think it's a little bit slept on as the tech card list has taken precedence. Another Spider-Man Brand New Day deck is Supergiant. When Spider-Man Brand New Day came out, my thought process was that if he made it into Supergiant, then Nightcrawler was well and truly out of the metagame, and I do think that that is where we are. Supergiant cares so much about specific point allocations that being able to move twice is so incredibly useful because it means you can move under Supergiant to take priority or lose priority if you need to, and you can then reposition again. That's not even the only thing that this card is doing here. It is also in mirrors where you are both playing Wilson Fisk, making sure that your 2-drop is bigger than their 2-drop, so your Wilson Fisk comes down and everything else goes out the window. That's a mirror-winning play right there. The other thing that I would like to point out in this list is you don't necessarily have to have a Shadow King. That can be a Mercury, but I find Shadow King a little bit more generically applicable. This is a very powerful list that aims to disrupt your opponent with powerful Supergiant, Negasonic, Shadow King, Cosmos stuff, and if you disrupt your opponent enough, you are playing far more efficient, less you have to put less effort into getting your points than they do. You can just make your points happen. Your opponents usually have to do things in order to get points that are more than yours. The last of the 4 horsemen of the metagame apocalypse is the Many Men deck, and I think that people are finally wising up to how powerful this list is, because there's a lot of people playing Mercury now, but maybe they're just doing that by accident, and it was actually about trying to beat the Spider-Man, the new Spider-Man decks instead. Either way, the increased amount of Mercury has definitely made this deck get worse. It really needs to move stuff, and it's really obvious where that stuff is. It's still a playable list and still a powerful list, but Mercury is a real detriment to this list. This list is great at beating Shadow King stuff. It is not good at all at beating Mercury. And if you've noticed when I've been doing this video, I've talked a lot about, hey, look at all of this stuff. You could replace Shadow King with Mercury if you want, and the more people do that, the worse this deck gets. Now, I know some people might be thinking, hey, KM, this is kind of a stale meta. We've seen all these decks before. And if that's you, I have good news. I am going to use this video to announce the KMBest Block Party number 3, which will be next Saturday. And there will be a ban list, spoiler alert, involving many of the cards we just talked about. So if you want to have a different experience of Marvel Snap, make sure you stick around to the end of the video for the details. Fantomex is kind of like the 5th horseman of this metagame. Like, we talked about the 4 that have been passing the top title around. I don't know that I've ever thought Fantomex was the best deck in the game, but I do know that I've thought it was the most obviously good deck in the metagame, and very little has changed about that. This deck just has so many efficient pieces of interaction and so much power in it that it's just very difficult for it to ever be bad in these kind of situations. Now, a lot of that is down to how well these tech cards line up against things that are happening. You can do things like, let's say you don't want to have the Mobius in here, replace it with a Mercury, right? Tons of different options. We've talked a lot about putting Mercury into these lists. I haven't felt pressured to do that personally, because I think a lot of the stuff that Mercury is good against is stuff I'm already really good against, being a Shadow King deck. But if you want extra insurance, that is a very reasonable thing to do. This is a list that thrives on many of the same principles that we've discussed for Supergiant, and the same principles that frankly apply to a lot of decks in Marvel Snap. Is if you're going to be playing stat sticks, you need a way to prevent your opponent from going over the top of your stat sticks, and right now that's just fit some tech cards in there, make sure things aren't happening. And I think, you look at the V-hand lists that are focusing on the tech versions, they're like this. That's kind of all tech decks fundamentally, is they're not just all tech, they're built around a point package, and then your goal is, with the tech, prevent anything from going over the top of your point package. And Fantomex is amazing at that. I've had a lot of good games with this list recently, and it strikes me as sort of constructed very similarly to the teched out V-hand lists, where there's these really spiky games where you're just like rolling downhill with early Sam, Batroc, Kraven, and then locking the game up with all these tech cards. I believe this list came from Chamo, which kind of makes sense. This is a deck that sort of seems very stylistically like him, and he's one of my favorite deck builders in Marvel Snap because it's also very stylistically like me. Much like the Paraguayan national team in the World Cup, this is a list that is built on absolutely stifling and shameless defense. You are going to make your opponents feel bad. You are going to do bad things to them. Their deck's not going to work, and you're going to sit there and you're going to point and you're going to laugh and you're going to scuff up the penalty spot. That's what this deck is built to do. And I think that this is a really legitimate attempt at saying, this is what Batroc needs in terms of how does Batroc become a more real deck in a world where so many people are playing like this Horseman Gambit stuff. And the answer is not play a bunch of like armors or whatever to make sure you're not getting Horseman Gambited. It's turn them off. Play a Mobius. Prevent them from doing stuff. Play a Wilson Fisk. That doesn't die to a Gambit. Play a Miles Morales. That doesn't die to a Gambit, right? Like, that is actually sort of the direction that I like about this, where it's like, here are these big guys that discount, here is my Mobius, and I think that I can actually have these good stats games that actually match up well into the game, into the matchup. And obviously, if you're playing Mobius, you have a very solid matchup against the other version of V-Hand, which is the one that's playing a bunch of Sasquatch stuff. That's basically free if you play a Mobius. So this is a list that I really like in terms of what is the best move deck? A lot of people are playing a bunch of weird move decks with Aunt May and with Mary Jane. And fundamentally, if someone was like, what is the best move deck? What is the move deck you'd play? It'd be this. The Agamotto scam list is a pretty strong list that has a bunch of game into a bunch of stuff. This is a list that has so much value from hand that there's just a ton of things that can go right for you and wrong for your opponent that they won't really have a lot of understanding of the range. This is a deck that can do anything from playing 3 Lady Bullseyes floating 10 energy to a deck that can do things like play 3 Horseman Gambits off an Images of Icon, or go 33 points tall in a lane because they have an Agamotto in it, which would actually be 39 or whatever. Like, you get the idea here. The basic premise of this deck is that the final turn is totally inscrutable. There is no way of knowing what the hell you're going to do. It is one of the scariest decks to play against the entirety of Marvel's Snap because of the immense amount of options it has access to on the final turn. I also want to shout out Wong. Wong is a card that is a pretty obviously counterable card, but I honestly think he's just kind of underrated at this point because of how obviously counterable he is. When people don't counter him, you're gonna win games, and there really isn't much else to say about that. Speaking of when people don't counter him, you're gonna win games, this is the glassest cannon in the Marvel Snap meta. A Man-Spider Fallen 1 Star-Lord Master of the Sun deck that is built primarily on doing something pretty telegraphed, but extremely stupid when it works. The power output here is immense. The numbers are extremely large. If your opponent has the cards that interact with you profitably, you're in a lot of trouble. But we spent a lot of this video talking about how you can replace Shadow King for Mercury and stuff. And there are a lot of people who are doing that. And as long as that kind of stuff is happening, you have a very real shot at just instantly bully snapping anyone in any situation. The problem is you won't know if you're safe or not. And fundamentally, that is problematic. You do have a Juggernaut that can help protect you, and sometimes your energy expenditure is enough that it just doesn't matter if they have the right interaction. But this is a very fragile list, with notably an incredibly high level of output when it works. I've enjoyed Doom 2099 recently. I did a video on it yesterday, and you might have noticed I did actually finally make the Chamber for Sam Wilson switch after spending 50 games talking about how awful Chamber was. Yeah, Sam Wilson's better. This is a strong, solid, easy deck that I don't think by any means is broken. It just happens to have a lot of things that match up well into a lot of other things. If you're missing one of the 3s, replace it with Mercury. We've already talked about that kind of stuff. Doom 2099 does not have the ability to play things like Cosmo, really. It wants to play a tech card that you just get on the board and is proactive and does stuff. Mercury's a good option there if that's the kind of stuff you're seeing a lot of, but you don't really get to play Cosmo. You don't really get to play Shadow King, so it's Mercury. The other thing that you can think about doing is trying to get Aurora back in here for the Galactus, but I don't know. I have a pretty complex relationship with Galactus in this list, which is to say, I think he mostly sucks. I think he's mostly awful. But sometimes you just actually need a guy who's big. And yes, you know, that's not all the time, and he's very predictable, and your opponent will definitely be aware of him, but sometimes you actually just need a guy who is big in one lane, and he is that guy, and we just don't have a better card. Supergiant discard is a fun little twist on the discard archetype that is fundamentally trying to get a MODOK under a Supergiant, and then on the final turn of the game, do things like Moon Girl a hand full of Marrows and Proximas and Dakin Shards and Wolverines. That's the idea here. This is not a bad deck by any means. Doubling Marrows is really scary. Doubling Proximas is really scary. Having a relatively large statted men in the form of Meek and Mobius after you do this is really notable. And I think that this is also a deck that's fairly straightforward to play. Like, if you do things in this order, you're gonna make things work. Sometimes you'll draw your MODOK on the final turn of the game and you'll be like, oh man, I was gonna do a blink thing. It was gonna be awesome and now I lose, but that's life. It's a fairly straightforward flowcharty deck where the basic premise is I would like to copy my hand full of things that do stuff when they get discarded and then discard my entire hand. It's predictable, don't get me wrong. If your opponent is playing a Cosmo and you go Supergiant into that MODOK and they Cosmo you, that's because they know the deal. Like, that's just the kind of thing that can and will happen here. But there is a lot to be said for end of game, here's a bunch of stuff. Like, there's not a lot of good answers to it when it actually works, and there is kind of a lot of power here. And because so many decks are playing so many tech cards, this metagame tends to be with like a couple of really notable exceptions. Like, for example, notable exception number 1, Man Spider. Notable exception number 2, the Captain Carter combo deck. With a couple really notable exceptions, a lot of decks are just like, a bunch of tech cards, stripped down point packages, not really hitting massive point ceilings. And in a world where that is happening, this is also the same thing that lets Doom 2099 succeed, is all these people are playing all these tech card packages. It's just like, I don't care. You copied 75 Gambits. Okay, I've got a bunch of free Proximas and Marrows. I don't care. Like, there's just kind of a lot to be said for the metagame being very focused on tech card stuff, which comes to at the detriment of people's point output. And this is a deck that just does point output well enough to beat those decks. Zombie Galacti, another deck that benefits pretty heavily, actually, from Spider-Man Brand New Day, because he can buff something and then buff something else, and this deck is very often based on chains of buffs, and so he effectively gets to contribute to a buff and then contribute to a second buff, whether that be Jubilee, Maverick, or Stick. You are going to be able to get some cool stuff working. Another thing that the buff package has really added to this list is, like, the worst thing this guy's ever going to do is make Superior Spider-Man just be on consistently and then still be able to do other stuff. So your consistency really goes up with this list because of Spider-Man Brand New Day. He's just adding a lot of like, oh, you know, I didn't get magic, but I basically always have that 7th energy anyway. This is a bit of a deck that is like legitimately pretty powerful. It does some really legit stuff, but it does sort of clunk a little bit. It is still a magic deck. It is still the kind of thing that can be a little bit predictable. And I think it's a very respectable, very real deck that you should not be surprised to see. It's a strong enough deck to exist and justify its own existence by being part of that cohort of magic lists that just kind of overpower you if you aren't meaningfully interacting with them. Ongoing remains an extremely respectable list that has a lot of utility and a lot of ability to just win games that call for whatever needs to be called for, whether that's playing mid-rangey stuff with the 2 Captain Americas throwing a shield back and forth, or going extremely over the top with varieties of stupid Moonstone things. This is a deck that has a lot of play to it. You'll notice there's a Shadow King in here. It's because I'm not very confident in the Carter matchup otherwise, but against most other stuff, I'm feeling pretty decent. Now, the more things you see that are playing Cosmic Ghost Rider, the worse off you feel about this. But other than Cosmic Ghost Rider, I just haven't seen a lot of the stuff that normally makes you feel bad for playing a deck like this. The thing that actually makes me feel the most bad when I play a deck like this is just drawing my cards in the wrong order. Skipping a 2-drop sucks so bad. Like, it's a frustrating experience to play because you are a bit at the mercy of your draws, and the difference between your good draws and your bad draws is really massive. Like, a Sam Wilson on 2 probably raises this deck's win rate by an insane amount, despite the fact that Sam Wilson on 2 is not synergizing with all of this stuff. Just having extra bodies is so important to this deck. I think that there's a lot to be said for the power of this list and the ability of this list to accept snaps and just go over the top of them. I feel like this is an underrated deck right now. Last up, a pair of decks that I haven't seen a ton of, but I think are kind of getting underrated right now. The first is Small Surfer. Now, there's definitely less Mobius in this current metagame. A lot of the slots that were Mobius are either debatably becoming Mercury or have already become Mercury, and we've talked about that a lot in this video. This is a deck that loses pretty horrendously to Mobius, but if nobody's playing Mobius, this is one of the most consistent point outputs in the entire game. There's just a ton to be said for this. Now, the specific configuration that I have is not locked in at all. Namorita kind of a flex spot. How much do you care about being a Mercury deck? Do you want to get a second way to activate your things that give a bunch of power? Maybe you want to be like a Killmonger Nova deck. Bunch of things to consider. None of them I consider incredibly pressing here, but I do think that this is a really solid list to build off of that I'm very surprised I haven't seen any of. Almost everything I said about the previous list is even more true of this one. This is a super cold to Mobius list that nobody seems to be playing, even though half the people who were playing Mobius last week aren't playing Mobius anymore. And this deck was already pretty good. And I think there's a lot to be said for a deck that is just actually adapting to the metagame, not by saying, I am going to customize what I'm doing to beat the other people, but by saying, you guys have stopped customizing yourself to beat me. If I had to point at what I think an open lane in this metagame is, it's just stuff that loses to Mobius, because there's just notably less of it. And I think that this kind of stuff is really worth paying attention to on a week-to-week sliding scale. So I mentioned the third KMBest block party. That's going to be coming up on Saturday the 11th. It'll be at 6 p.m. Eastern, to the best of my knowledge. If it's not, check the description just to make sure I didn't mess anything up. Now, the way we're going to do this is there are going to be a couple of deck list requirements. In order to do this, what we're going to do is, first of all, there are going to be 5 cards that are banned. Those cards are Gambit, Horseman of Death, Supergiant, Arishem, Captain Carter, and Mercury. These bans are aimed pretty squarely at every good deck in the metagame, basically. They're just trying to deal with that kind of stuff. I am debating adding an extra ban here if we're worried about the multiple man deck too much. Mercury does exist in the real world and has definitely held that down, but if we are going to ban Mercury so that some of these new move cards can shine, might be a problem. That was also why I left Shadow King alone. Again, these are the preliminary bans. I think it's what we're going to be going with, but we still have like 12 hours from when I'm recording the video to actually make it happen. That said, that is what I'm expecting. The other thing that's happening with this tournament is there is going to be a requirement that your deck include a card that was released in the last 5 months, which not literally 5 months. It's just En Sabanur on, basically. As long as you're playing any card from En Sabanur on, you are good to go. Now, these are there because I am testing some tournament software, which is why I get to run these. I'm not the biggest fan of ban lists, but I do think that this metagame is stale enough that at least a ban list tournament could be an interesting direction to go. Let me know what you think, and of course, there will be a Discord sign-up link in the description as well. As always, I've been KMBest, you've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.